that they had no technology, that they could barely organize themselves into groups larger than a village, that they lived at the mercy of nature, without metal tools, without engineering, without science. That's what we were taught. But then someone needs to explain to me how, in the middle of a granite rock more than 200 meters tall, in the center of Sri Lanka, a civilization that history barely mentions built a palace suspended in the air, with water gardens of engineering so precise that even today, modern engineers cannot completely replicate the irrigation system. Someone needs to explain to me how stone blocks of more than 100 tons were fitted with precision of less than 1 millimeter, without mortar, without cement, without binders, at altitudes where the air is already too thin for heavy work. And someone needs to explain to me why, when archaeologists find these places, the first reaction of academia is not astonishment, but silence. Because astonishment would be inconvenient. Because astonishment would mean rewriting everything. Today, you are going to meet 6 structures that exist in the real world that can be visited, measured, photographed, and studied. 6 structures that directly contradict what we know or think we know about the past of humanity. And when you finish hearing this, tell me, do you still believe they were primitive? Let's start where everything becomes immediately impossible. Sri Lanka. Year 477 AD. A king named Kassapa rises to power in the most violent way possible. He kills his own father, buries the man alive in a wall, takes the throne, and he knows that his brother, the legitimate heir, will return to take revenge. So he does what any paranoid leader would do. He searches for the most indefensible place in the entire world and transforms that place into his fortress. The place he chose is called Sigiriya. In Sinhalese, the word means lion rock, and when you see the formation for the first time, you immediately understand why. A granite rock rises vertically from the ground for almost 220 meters. It is not a hill. It is not a mountain. It is a vertical wall of solid granite that simply erupts from the flat jungle floor, as if it had been placed there by some force that did not concern itself with conventional geological explanations. The top of the rock has an area of approximately 1.5 hectares, and on that top, Kassapa built a palace. But it is not the palace on top that will leave you without answers. What will leave you without answers is everything around it. Because Sigiriya is not just a rock with a palace on top, it is a complex, a system, an engineering work that extends over 18 hectares around the rock formation and rises through the rock itself in layers, as if the civilization that built it had not simply adapted architecture to the environment. It had designed the environment as architecture. The gardens around the base of Sigiriya are known as the oldest water gardens in the world, not the oldest in Asia, in the world. Dated to the 5th century after Christ, they present a system of channels, fountains, symmetric pools, and gates that respond to changes in the water table with a precision that 20th century hydraulic engineers took decades to completely understand. There are fountains in Sigiriya that still work after 1,500 years. Without mechanical maintenance, without electric pumping, working exclusively through hydrostatic pressure calculated by the engineers of King Kassapa in the 5th century of the Christian era. When modern researchers analyzed the underground drainage system of the gardens, they discovered that it had been built with an inclination calculated to the millimeter to ensure that water would flow in the right direction during the rainy season but would accumulate in the right cisterns during the dry season. This is not luck. This is hydrology. This is civil engineering with a level of precision that the Western world would only formalize as an academic discipline in the 18th century. And there is more. On the west wall of the rock, the smoothest and most vertical of all, there is a gallery of mural paintings that has survived for 15 centuries on the exposed face of vertical granite, subject to tropical rains, winds, and constant humidity. The paintings show women, hundreds of them, female figures in natural size with elaborate ornaments, skins of different tones, individualized expressions. They are not schematic or simplified figures like what we would expect from primitive rock painting. They are works with shading, perspective, movement, figures so alive that King Kassapa, according to Sinhalese historical records, wrote poems to them. Tourists visiting Sigiriya during the Middle Ages, centuries after the death of Kassapa, left recorded on the polished wall mirrors of the gallery more than 1,800 inscriptions in verse, mostly poems addressed to the painted figures. 1,800 inscriptions from medieval visitors who were so impressed with the art that they felt the need to respond to it poetically. But what most intrigues modern engineers is not the gardens, not the paintings, not even the palace on top. It is the entrance. To reach the top of the rock, you had to pass through the Lion Gate, a passage carved into the face of the rock itself, flanked by two giant lion paws carved in granite at life scale. Each paw is more than 8 meters tall. The complete lion, according to archaeological estimates based on the foundations found, must have been more than 30 meters tall in total. 30 meters, carved into the face of a vertical rock in the 5th century. What remained of the paws was enough for archaeologists to calculate the original proportions, and what they discovered is that the sculpture followed the canons of classical Sinhalese Buddhist art, with a geometric precision that required sophisticated measuring tools, the ability to work in scale from a smaller design, and an organization of labor that allowed dozens, perhaps hundreds of artisans to work simultaneously on different parts of the same sculpture while maintaining perfect coherence in the final result. On a vertical rock, 200 meters off the ground, in the 5th century after Christ. Kassapa lived in Sigiriya for only 18 years. His brother returned as promised, and the defeated king took his own life before being captured. The palace was abandoned. Buddhist monks occupied it for a few centuries, then they too left. For more than 1,000 years, Sigiriya lay there in the middle of the Sinhalese jungle, being slowly swallowed by vegetation, visited only by birds and snakes, and by the few medieval travelers who left their poems carved on the polished walls. The Western world would only officially rediscover it in 1831, when a British officer named Jonathan Forbes came upon the structure during a military expedition. His notes describe something that he could not name, a thing that seemed too impossible to have been made by men. In 1982, UNESCO declared Sigiriya a World Heritage Site. In 2022, a team of engineers from the University of Moratuwa spent 6 months studying the hydraulic system of the gardens and published a report concluding that the original engineering was, in several specific technical aspects, more efficient than the irrigation systems installed in the region during the 20th century. More efficient with 1,500 more years. But Sigiriya, however extraordinary it may be, has at least a partially satisfactory explanation. We know the name of the king who ordered it built. We have historical records. We have an approximate date. We have context. The next structures have none of this. Let's go to Peru. But not to Machu Picchu. Everyone knows Machu Picchu. Let's go to Sacsayhuamán. Most people pronounce this name wrong, so let me help you. In Quechua, the language of the Incas, it is pronounced approximately Sacsayhuamán. The Spanish soldiers who arrived in Peru in the 16th century had so much difficulty with the pronunciation that they came to call it sexy woman, which is perhaps the most embarrassing mispronunciation in the history of colonial archaeology. Sacsayhuamán is on the outskirts of the city of Cusco, just over 2 kilometers from the historic center. You can walk there leaving the center of the city. It's easy to find. It is impossible to explain. The structure is a fortress, or at least that is what the Spanish assumed when they arrived there. Zigzag walls, 3 lines of defense in ascending terraces, looking over the Cusco Valley like a stone sentinel. But the blocks that form these walls belong to a different category from everything else the Incas built elsewhere. The largest stone block in Sacsayhuamán is 9 meters tall, 5 meters wide, 4 meters deep, and weighs an estimated 360 tons. 360 tons. For reference, a modern war tank, a Leopard 2, weighs 60 tons. You would need 6 war tanks stacked to equal the weight of a single block of Sacsayhuamán, and that block was not found there. It was transported. The nearest quarry that produces this type of limestone is 35 kilometers away. 35 kilometers of Andean terrain with elevations that rise and fall hundreds of meters, through which a stone of 360 tons was moved. When you ask conventional archaeologists how this was done, the answer is always the same: earth ramps, ropes, rolling logs, and a lot of human labor. This answer has a serious problem. Modern engineers calculated that to move a block of 360 tons across mountainous terrain using exclusively human strength with ropes and logs, you would need an earth ramp so large that the amount of material to build the ramp would be greater than the amount of material of the final structure itself. You would build a mountain to move a stone, and then you would need to undo the mountain. And there is no archaeological evidence of these supposed giant ramps anywhere around Sacsayhuamán. But the problem of giant blocks is only half the mystery. The other half is the fit. The blocks of Sacsayhuamán are not rectangular, they are not cubes, they are irregular shapes, polygons, with 12, 14, 16 sides, each contact surface perfectly sculpted to fit with absolute precision into the adjacent blocks. A razor blade cannot pass through the joint between two blocks of Sacsayhuamán. This has been verified repeatedly by researchers, engineers, and tourists over decades. A razor blade. In 1950, an earthquake of magnitude 6.2 destroyed much of the city of Cusco. The Spanish colonial buildings, built with lime mortar and bricks, collapsed. The Inca walls of polygonal masonry, built without any mortar, without any glue, without any binder, survived intact. The Spanish, when they arrived in Peru, were so impressed with the quality of Inca constructions that they dismantled parts of Sacsayhuamán to use the stones in the construction of churches and palaces in Cusco. They could not use the larger blocks. They had no way to move the large stones, so they took the smaller ones and left the large ones where they were. This is why the structure we see today is only a fraction of what Sacsayhuamán must have originally been. What survived are the stones that 16th century Spanish could not steal because they were too large for them to transport. Think about that for a moment. The stones that 16th century Spanish, with horses, pulleys, metal levers, and all the mechanical technology of Renaissance Europe, could not move, were placed there by the Incas, or by whoever built that before the Incas. Because there is a question that few tour guides mention. The Incas themselves, when questioned by the Spanish about who had built Sacsayhuamán, said they did not know. They said the structure was already there when the Incas arrived, that they had only expanded and reused it. Inca Garcilaso de la Vega, son of a Spanish conquistador and an Inca princess, wrote in the 16th century that the Incas attributed the original construction of Sacsayhuamán to a race of giants that had existed before them. Giants or not, someone moved 360 tons of stone 35 kilometers across Andean terrain and fitted them with sub-millimeter precision without any binding agent. And to this day, we do not know how. If Sacsayhuamán raises questions about technical capacity, the next structure raises questions about the very calendar of human civilization. Göbekli Tepe, southeast Turkey. Near the city of Şanlıurfa, on what is today the border between Turkey and Syria. In 1994, a Kurdish farmer named Savak Yildiz was plowing a field when the plow struck something hard. He stopped, dug a little with his hands, and found stone. Worked stone. Carved stone. He called the authorities. The authorities called archaeologists. And the archaeologists, when they began to excavate, became progressively more quiet. Because what was underneath Savak Yildiz's field was a structure 12,000 years old. 12,000 years. For reference, the pyramids of Egypt are approximately 4,500 years old. The Great Wall of China began to be built about 2,300 years ago. Göbekli Tepe is more than twice as old as any other known monumental construction. It is older than agriculture. That is the detail that paralyzes archaeologists. Humans 12,000 years ago, according to the dominant historical model, were hunter-gatherers, nomads, small groups that followed the hunt and the cycles of natural harvest. They had no permanent settlements. They had no complex social organization. They had, in theory, no capacity to build anything monumental, because any monumental construction requires sedentary, specialized, and organized labor. Göbekli Tepe has 22 circles of stone identified to date, of which only a fraction has been excavated. Each circle is composed of T-shaped pillars up to 6 meters tall and 45 tons in weight. The pillars are carved with animals in high relief: foxes, snakes, birds, spiders, lions, gazelles, scorpions. The sculptures are naturalistically precise. They are not schematic or symbolic representations. They are recognizable animals with correct anatomy in dynamic poses, with expression and movement captured in limestone with a skill that presumes a long history of artistic development. Which leads us to a disturbing question. If Göbekli Tepe represents the beginning, if it is the first monumental construction of humanity, where did the ability to produce it come from with this level of sophistication? Art does not arise with technical perfection. Every artistic tradition begins with attempts, with errors, with simplifications. The learning curve exists. But there is nothing before Göbekli Tepe. No site that shows the progression from crudely symbolic sculpture to the naturalistic that should have preceded what we find there. Göbekli Tepe appears in the archaeological record already in its complete form, already with technical and artistic complexity that has no identifiable precedent. Klaus Schmidt, the German archaeologist who led the excavations for almost 2 decades until his death in 2014, spent years articulating what he called the inverted temple hypothesis. The conventional theory says humans become farmers, form permanent villages, develop food surplus, create social hierarchy, and only then do they have the resources and organization to build temples. Schmidt proposed the inverse. Göbekli Tepe was built first. The temple came before the village. The sacred came before the sedentary. And the need to maintain, to visit, to ritualistically return to the sacred site was what forced hunter-gatherers to invent agriculture, to create permanent settlements, to develop the entire structure of civilization that we know. We did not build temples because we became civilized. We became civilized because we felt the need to build temples. If Schmidt is right, and most contemporary archaeologists increasingly believe he is, then religion is not a product of civilization. Civilization is a product of religion. And Göbekli Tepe, that plowed field of a Kurdish farmer, is the buried evidence of that uncomfortable truth. But there is something even more disturbing. Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried. It was not covered by the passage of time, by the natural accumulation of sediment over millennia. It was terraced intentionally. Someone, at some point around 8,000 years ago, decided to cover each of the stone circles with tons of earth and rubble. Why? No one knows. Some theories speak of closing ritual, of burying a sacred place to consecrate it definitively to the past. Other theories, more speculative, speak of deliberate concealment, of protecting the structure from something or someone. The fact is that the decision to bury Göbekli Tepe is the only reason it survived 12,000 years. Whoever buried it left us, without knowing, the greatest archaeological gift in human history. We stayed in the same time corridor, but we crossed continents. Bolivia, Andean Plateau, altitude of 3,800 meters above sea level, just 50 kilometers from Lake Titicaca. Pumapunku, part of the larger archaeological complex of Tiwanaku. Pumapunku is often called by less conventional archaeologists as the most disturbing place on planet Earth. Let me tell you why. The stone blocks of Pumapunku are not just large, they are precise in a way that makes no sense in the historical context attributed to them. Conventional archaeologists date Pumapunku to around 500–700 AD, attributing it to the Tiwanaku civilization. Some geological and astronomical studies suggest much older dates, potentially reaching 12,000 years, which would place them contemporary with Göbekli Tepe. This point is controversial. and I will be honest about it. But the dating, whatever it may be, does not solve the main problem. The main problem is the cuts. The blocks of andesite and diorite of Pumapunku, two of the hardest materials that exist in nature, present surfaces that are geometrically perfect to the touch, not approximately flat, flat like a mirror, flat like the polished glass of optical equipment. There are H-shaped notches, perfectly straight channels, circular holes with smooth internal walls, parallel grooves spaced with uniform precision. Diorite, the stone used in several of the most elaborate blocks of Pumapunku, has hardness of 8.5 on the Mohs scale. To work diorite, you need a tool harder than diorite. On the Mohs scale, that means diamond, or very hardened metal tools. The Tiwanaku civilization was in the Bronze Age. Its metal tools, even the most sophisticated ones found, are not consistent with the production of the cuts we see in Pumapunku. A geologist named David Childress conducted electron microscopy analyses on surfaces of blocks of Pumapunku and found tool marks that he described as inconsistent with any known tool of the time. The marks suggest either a high-speed rotating cutting instrument or an abrasion technology with extremely hard material applied under controlled pressure. Academia rejected Childress's conclusions as unverified speculation. But no one has presented a convincing alternative explanation for the cuts. There is one piece in particular that receives the name of H-stone, so called for the shape of the notch that runs through it. The geometric precision of the notch is such that exact copies of this piece, created with modern CNC laser cutting tools for museum purposes, require microscopic adjustments to achieve the same precision as the original. Laser cutting tools. To copy the work of a civilization that, according to textbooks, used stone and bronze. And there is still the question of transport. The nearest andesite quarry to Pumapunku is on the Island of the Sun in Lake Titicaca, 90 kilometers away. 90 kilometers that include the lake itself. The largest blocks of Pumapunku weigh between 30 and 86 tons. How do you transport 86 tons of stone 90 kilometers across Andean terrain at almost 4,000 meters altitude? The conventional answer is the same as always. Rafts on the lake, ramps, logs, ropes, massive labor. The unconventional answer is, we do not know, and we should be more honest about it. We cross to the east now, to a place that most people have never heard of in one of the most remote regions of the planet, Micronesia, island of Pohnpei, Pacific Ocean, Nan Madol. If you have never heard of Nan Madol, do not be surprised. For centuries, it was accessible only by boat, hidden among mangroves, and even the local indigenous populations had no clear memory of how it had been built. Nan Madol is a city built over the ocean, over a coral reef lagoon. 92 artificial islets, each created by stacking dark basalt in natural, hexagonal prisms, all interconnected by navigable channels. The total city covers more than 8 square kilometers. The basalt columns that form the structures weigh from 5 to 50 tons each. The total amount of basalt in the construction is estimated at 750,000 tons. 750,000 tons of stone stacked in the ocean. The basalt columns are natural forms. Basalt, when cooled under certain conditions, spontaneously fragments into hexagonal prisms, like those we see in the Fingals columns in Scotland or the Giant's Causeway in Ireland. In Pohnpei, these natural prisms were extracted and transported from the quarries to the construction site. The problem is that the quarries are on the opposite side of the island, the other end of Pohnpei. And between the quarries and Nan Madol, there is an 80-kilometer turn of coastal sea in wooden boats, moving 50-ton stones. In canoes, European colonizers who arrived in Pohnpei in the 18th and 19th centuries questioned the local inhabitants about who had built Nan Madol. The consistent answer they received was that the city had been built by 2 sorcerers named Olisipa and Olisopa, who arrived in a canoe from the east carrying a stone altar. The sorcerers, according to oral tradition, lifted the stones with magic. Now, we can dismiss magic as an explanation, but what oral tradition is recording in an inevitably symbolic way is that the builders of Nan Madol had a capacity that later inhabitants of the island no longer possessed and could not explain. In 2016, UNESCO listed Nan Madol as a World Heritage Site, describing it as one of the most extraordinary places on the planet. The listing also included a mention of concerning conservation status. Because Nan Madol is sinking, the artificial islets are tilting, the channels are clogging with sediment, the walls are collapsing, and the government of Micronesia does not have the resources to restore and maintain a structure the size of an entire city built over the ocean. In 2016, UNESCO placed Nan Madol on the list of World Heritage in danger. A city built in the ocean with 750,000 tons of basalt that has survived centuries of cyclones and tides is in danger not because of natural elements. It is in danger because we have no idea how it was built, and therefore we have no idea how to restore it. The last structure on this list is in certain respects the most disturbing of all, not because of size, not because of age, but because of the absence of any reason for it to exist. China, Zhejiang Province, on the banks of the Qiu River. In 1992, workers who were lowering the level of a reservoir for installation of a water pump began to find empty spaces in the interior of the rock. They thought of natural erosion. They called geologists. Geologists did what geologists do: mapped, measured, analyzed, and then fell silent. Because what was inside the rock were caves, not natural caves, artificial caves, 24 underground chambers of monumental dimensions, manually excavated in solid Longyu sandstone at depths reaching 30 meters below the surface. The largest of them has an area of more than 18,000 square meters. For comparison, that is larger than the Maracanã Stadium before the renovations. The Longyu Caves. The ceiling of each chamber is supported by stone columns left in place during excavation, calculated with precision to distribute the weight of the overlying rock without the use of any external reinforcement. The geometry of the columns, the spacing between them, the proportion between the free span and the thickness of the columns, everything obeys structural principles that today's engineers recognize as valid. The internal walls of all 24 chambers are marked by parallel incisions forming a 45-degree pattern, uniform and continuous, as if the entire internal surface of the rock had been worked with a single-pointed instrument applied in repetitive rhythmic movements. Archaeologists estimated that the excavation of the 24 chambers would have required the removal of approximately 1 million cubic meters of rock. 1 million cubic meters, with hand tools. All of this is not what makes the Longyu Caves disturbing. What makes the Longyu Caves disturbing is this: there is no historical record of them. China has one of the oldest and most meticulous historiographical traditions in the world. Records of public works, of great construction undertakings, of mobilizations of labor, of taxes associated with monumental projects exist for the Great Wall, for the Grand Canal of China, for imperial mausoleums. For the Longyu Caves, there is nothing, not a single record in any archive, imperial or local, of who commissioned them, who built them, when they were built, what they were for. Nothing. Archaeologists dated the caves by fragments of ceramics found inside at approximately 2,200 years ago, during the Qin dynasty or early Han dynasty. This period is extensively documented in Chinese history, but there is not a single mention in any Chinese document of any era of 24 monumental chambers excavated in Longyu. It is as if the caves had been built by people who existed outside of history. And there is still a question that archaeologists cannot solve. Where did the rock go? 1 million cubic meters of sandstone was removed from inside the Longyu Hill. This material has to be somewhere. Was it thrown in the river, transported to another location, used in another construction? There is no trace. There is no accumulation of rubble in the vicinity. There is no other construction in the region that exhibits sandstone compatible with the material from the caves. 1 million cubic meters of stone disappeared without a trace. 6 structures: Sri Lanka, Peru, Turkey, Bolivia, Micronesia, China. Different continents, oceans between them, millennia of distance in the chronology we have. And yet, when you look at what unites them, you find a pattern that is hard to ignore. All of them display a level of engineering disproportionate to what we attribute to the cultures that produce them. All of them involve movement of materials on scales that defy conventional explanations based on human strength and primitive tools. All of them show a degree of planning and coordination that presumes social structures, technical knowledge, and organizational capacities that the dominant historical model does not attribute to the periods in question. And all of them have in common a characteristic that is rarely discussed openly in conventional documentaries. All of them were built by people whose descendants did not know how to rebuild them. That is not a minor detail. When a civilization builds something with certain technology, that technology normally remains. It evolves, improves, is transmitted. The thread of technical knowledge is continuous. But Sacsayhuamán was expanded by the Incas with smaller blocks and less precise fits than the original stones they found there. The Incas themselves could not do what their predecessors had done. The fountains of Sigiriya have worked for 1,500 years, but no one in medieval Sri Lanka would know how to build them. The 24 chambers of Longyu do not appear in any record of the dynasty that, according to dating, was contemporary to its construction. What happened to the knowledge? There are two possibilities, and both are disturbing in different ways. The first, there was a civilizational collapse, or several collapses, that interrupted the transmission of technical knowledge. Advanced civilizations, or at least technically more sophisticated than we assume, existed and disappeared, leaving behind structures that their successors knew how to use, but did not know how to create. This is not a fantasy theory. Civilizational collapses are documented. The Bronze Age collapse, around 1200 BC, destroyed in just a few decades almost all the complex civilizations of the Mediterranean and the Middle East. Writing was lost. Trade routes disappeared. Urban populations returned to nomadism. If a collapse like that can happen in the full documented Bronze Age, why cannot it have happened before, in periods that we are still trying to understand? The second possibility, the structures were built by people more capable than we assume, and the model we have of human prehistory is fundamentally incomplete, not necessarily because there were aliens or magic technology, but because we are reconstructing 200,000 years of human history from fragments, from pieces of pottery, from bones, from carbon-14 traces, and assuming that what survived adequately represents what existed. And what if it does not represent? And what if there were periods of technical and social sophistication that simply did not leave preservable organic records, whose only remaining evidence are the stones that were too large to be destroyed? In 1995, no one knew that Göbekli Tepe existed. In 1991, no one knew that the Longyu Caves existed. How much more is still there, underground, underwater, inside hills that no one has yet decided to excavate? Academia teaches us that the past is known, that the great discoveries are made, that what is lacking are details. But the archaeological discoveries of the last decades suggest the opposite. They suggest that we are at the beginning of understanding human history, that the map we have is wrong at fundamental points, that there are civilizations, or at least civilizational capacities, that we do not yet formally recognize, because what we find of them does not fit in the categories we created. Sigiriya, Sacsayhuamán, Göbekli Tepe, Pumapunku, Nan Madol, the Longyu Caves. These are not isolated cases of archaeological anomaly. They are 6 points of a pattern. And where there is a pattern, there is a story that has not yet been told completely. History does not say they were primitive because it has solid evidence of this. History says they were primitive because it is simpler, because it is more comfortable, because the alternative requires that we admit that we do not know as much as we think we know. And epistemological humility, the willingness to say, I cannot explain this here and I need to continue investigating, is perhaps the rarest and most necessary capacity that science can cultivate. These stones will be there tomorrow, after us, just as they were before, waiting for someone to ask the right question.